Hello and welcome back. Apologies for a slight technical hitch. Someone pulled an important plug out that reset a lot of things, but we're back. Big thanks to our tech team actually for handling that so well. Thank you guys. I thought I should just say thank you for all that rich feedback from the morning sessions, capturing what we discussed and learned through the field trips and also in the workshop sessions. Just to let you know, that information doesn't disappear into void. Those summaries will be written up. They'll be available on the website for us to reflect on and to learn from. And in some sense, that's a legacy part of the conference, which will be available for the public to look at. But it will also be some really rich material for the Pinewood Partnership to build from as they take things forward. So thank you for doing that. We're into our final session. We've got two amazing speakers lined up. As ever, the question space is open on Slido, so feel free to use that, please do. And without further ado, it's a real privilege to welcome our next speaker, Professor Rob Wilson of the University of St Andrews. Rob is a dendrochronologist. His tree ring research has helped to uncover some of the significant drivers of climate change, not just in recent times, but over the long period up until now. So Rob has a very detailed knowledge of our pine woods. He spent a lot of time in them. He sampled many of them as part of the Scottish Pine Project. And it's just a great privilege to have Rob with us here today to share with us some of the findings of his research and specifically what that means for us with the questions and challenges that we're reflecting on. So without further ado, would you please welcome Professor Rob Wilson. Thank you.
Okay. Well, notice the title's changed. I thought 1 hour was too long, so I took the international bit out. So we're focusing on Scotland. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this sort of initial statement here. We're looking at a system here, a natural sort of forest system that's constantly shifting, partly as a function of climate and partly as a function of human influences over time, and then everything's related. And I don't need to go into these kind of shots. We've seen many, Shayla's work and so forth, but here's a shot from Abernethy over only a 14-year period, and we can clearly see when the conditions are favorable, we see substantial regeneration. And there's one message that will come out of this is everything's easy in the Cairngorms, right? It's the western pine woods when it gets problematic. And it's nothing to denigrate what's being done in the Cairngorms. But, so I'm a climatologist. And so I was kind of surprised I was invited here because a lot of what you guys are kind of thinking about for the next 100 years are more kind of ecological problems about how to manage the pine woodlands. So what I'm going to be talking about mostly in this talk is actually kind of unpublished and ongoing work that I've been fiddling around with. And I had a PhD student who was working on a sort of update of the network a few years ago. And then they got to the end of their PhD and decided to take a job elsewhere and didn't publish it. So a lot of this is unpublished, but will now be published over the coming years because I think it's extremely relevant for what you are thinking with for the future. So I just thought I'd just talk about briefly, I'm going to be really focusing more on the historical period, but let's just give ourselves, Graham's, timeline over there. So if we want to look back, most of the Holocene, the last 10,000 years ago, we've got paleoecological archives, mostly dominated by pollen records. And whether they're from lake sediments or peat bog sediments, we can come up with a relatively rich, long-term metric. I'm really worried I'm going to fall off, but I do wonder, so I'm trying to fix here. All right, so here we have a figure here. I'll move on the side here. Now, this is from the Cairngorms. It's an unpublished pollen record from Loch Ellen in Rothiemurchus. And just look at the dark band here. And I wanted to highlight that actually, even our knowledge over the sort of last 9,000 years is maybe not as well constrained as we'd like to think. Okay, so we have our initial jump up. So this is the actual dated timeline here. So around 9 to 8,000 years ago, we get a big jump up in the pine pollen. We have a period of about 1,000 to 1,500 years of kind of, let's call that the early Holocene optimum. And then we get an earlier decline, and then it wobbles around. And then we get to 2,000 years ago, and then we get into the recent period where these lake sediment records become problematic. On this side here, these are just a histogram of carbon-dated subfossil remnants that we've been dragging out of lakes. And you can see for the last 2,000 years, we've got lots of material. And we've got lots of material around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and not so much between. Although we've got more data now from Glen Affric where we can fill in some of these areas. So there is not a potential for an 8,000-year chronology, but we've got lots of material going back to that period. Now, notice this peak jump around 9,000 years ago. And Althea Davis here provided this as the Glen Affric equivalent record here. And there it's a bit later. It's about 500 years later at that part of Glen Affric where we get peak pollen. There's a little bit of a decline. It wobbles on. And then this is this sort of infamous 4,000 years ago kind of pollen decline that we see. But again, just to... this decline is different, slightly different story than what we see in the Cairngorms. And they're only 90 kilometers apart. And we've got work with the Karua posse are here. You know, we've got a pollen record that we're developing there. And there the story's completely different, right? Much less pine, more deciduous material and so forth. And that's a story for another day. And Kaylee, my PhD student's working on that somewhere in here. So if we go to the more recent period, then there's archival sources. So again, we've heard from many people here. Old maps are proving very useful for the last few centuries. We can even go to sort of estate documents about timber trade and other activities on all of these estates. And Chris Smout's work is a good example, an exemplar of what you can get from estate archives if you've got the time and patience to wade through dusty lofts and find all those documents. So the focus of this talk is really going to be on what we can get out of the tree ring record. That's what I want to get the message across about the information about past woodland dynamical changes and maybe what's sort of driving productivity. So we can look at the living trees, of course, and they give us, over the whole sort of network, really good information for the last 200-300 years. Of course, there's older trees. We can look at timbers from historical structures, so work with Corley Mills and dating. That might give us sporadic information, but we can provenance it to Scotland or other areas. That gives us information on different periods. Then a lot of the work I've been doing is remnant material. So that could be material that we're dragging out of lochs or peat bogs. We date them. They go back quite far. And also James is getting very excited about these dead woodlands where we've got stumps everywhere. And theoretically, we could date some of this material depending on the reference material that we have available. So I'm going to be really focusing on this aspect in the talk. So this map here presents all the red dots are all the sites we've sampled since 2007 when I first started. And each dot basically represents a living site where we've sampled 20 to 30 trees, where we've just taken some cores out of the trees and built chronologies of varying variables. In some locations, we've sampled over 100 trees for different questions. And then we've extracted dead remnant material from the loch environments. Hugely exhausting work for definitely a young person's job now. And we focused on the northern Cairngorms, going from Rothiemurchus right through to Abernethy, and then also the multiple lochs in Glen Affric. And this material goes back 8,000 years. It gives us a rich story. So we'll keep coming back to some of that material, but I'm really focusing on the last 1,000 years in all of that. Okay, so this is the conference, the Western Pinewoods. So I always talked about the Western Pinewoods as the Western Pine problem. For my work, they've been a particular headache. Basically, modeling of the relationship between growth, productivity, and interannual variability and climate has been particularly problematic. The trees in the west appear to be, at least they show more expression of disturbance, more than we see in the east in the Cairngorms. And I'm really going to be talking about these issues, and more importantly, perhaps, when we're talking about how we're managing these woodlands for the future, is the recent period, is that in many of the Western Pinewoods, we're seeing a sort of decline in productivity in the very, very recent period. We're talking in the last 10 years, which, if that is something related to changes in the environment or climate change, then we need to be really cogent about that and try and understand that. And I don't have all the answers, but I'll finish off with some ideas about what that might mean. So very quickly, this image didn't work out very well, but we can measure all sorts of variables from a tree ring archive. We can do ring width. We can measure density, we can do stable isotopes, and we can even go down to the cellular electrical. So we can measure all sorts. So for this talk, I'm just really focusing on ring width and density for two good reasons, really. Ring width is this aggregate variable. Okay, that's the sort of basically the carbon that the tree has sequestered, and this is a function of multiple parameters that affect tree growth over time. It's climate, site ecological differences, but also disturbance. And if we can disaggregate those different signals, then we can actually understand all those variables. Where the ring density parameter, this is what I use, this is my sort of bread and butter, is gives us this nice, clear climate signal. And if we can then get the climate signal out of this data, and then we can then basically look at the difference between that data and the ring width, and then we can look at disturbance and so forth. So I'm going to give you sort of two sort of approaches of using these data to understand past woodland dynamics. So just some example time series from Glen Affric, just to give you an idea of the information and what these data look like. So here we have just an example of an individual tree from Glen Affric. So normally when you see a stump of a tree, you see wide rings in the middle, steadily getting thinner towards the edge. And that's just essentially basically that every year, on average, the tree will sequester about the same amount of carbon, but as the tree gets bigger, then those rings get smeared out over an ever-increasing girth. And we can model that quite easily with some sort of negative exponential function. So that's kind of a tree growing in a relatively open canopy environment, and it's easy to remove that, what we call a growth trend, and whatever's left is the ecological and the climatological signal. This tree, however, for example, when it germinated and it started growing, it was in a relatively dense canopy, so it had relatively slow growth, and then after about 70, 80 years, it became co-dominant with the largest trees in the stand, and then this decline that we see in most of the other ones starts. So we get this much more complex growth form. So that's a stand dynamical signal with just young tree and a dense canopy and so forth. Now we have an example where there is suddenly a release in growth. And here we have a situation where, again, we've got a tree in a dense canopy, light limited, growing slowly, and then suddenly a substantial amount of the trees around it have been reduced, right? So timber clearance of some form, unknown amount, 50%, 60%, who knows? But you get this big release of growth, and then it will become a or dominant tree in that system. So we can use this information if we assume that that's related to disturbance, clearing, for example, timber cutting. And this is about 10 years ago now, we worked with a forest ecologist from Rider University in the US, where he came up with a modeling approach where we could predict what the tree would have done without the disturbance, right? So the black line is the actual release event here, and then the difference between these two was what we call the disturbance chronology, and this was the extra carbon that was sequestered because of that increase in growth. Now, my job as the climate guy, I'm interested in the one that's been corrected. We use this just to correct for these disturbance signals. What we never actually published was actually the woodland history related to all of this rich data about these release events in the tree ring data. Okay? So let's just then explore this and see what actually information we can put all together. So here's Glengarry, a fairly poorly sampled, in a very state of degradation, I guess. The red line is the one I want you to really focus on here. The blue shading at the back is the number of trees we sampled. These are establishment history bars and so forth. But the red line is the disturbance chronology. And we get a disturbance pulse in the early 19th century, an increase in growth and relatively growth, and then another one between the two world wars. These classic pulses of disturbance and timber clearance that we see. Now, I just wanted to highlight that when you're looking at these establishment histories, we are only, in all our sampling, we've sampled only co-dominant and dominant trees. Okay, we never do any sampling of young trees, say, from the last 100 years or so. So there is a bias in our data set to the sort of larger trees. But when we do this analysis on the whole network, and then we can just summarize this what we call the disturbance history, the orange bars is the relative disturbance in the west, while the darker bars are the disturbance stories in the cairngorms. Okay? So the expression of disturbance, and we're talking about release, is much stronger in the west than it is in the east. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the western trees are more sensitive to that disturbance, or was there more timber cutting in the west? We don't know, right? Now, my gut feeling is it's probably, and we'll talk about this, it's wetter in the west, and these trees are probably more susceptible because of hydrological changes when you have some sort of disturbance event. And I'll come back to that as well. But clearly, we have this stronger signal. So this was why this is the western problem, right? That we have a much noisier data set compared to the cairngorms. So we have a rich data source here that we can actually study past human impact on these woodland systems. So we've got several lines of evidence. We can look at regeneration dates and just simply look at the start dates of all the samples. That could be both from the living trees and also the subfossil material we're extracting from these lock environments. We could look at tree deaths, the end dates of these samples, but with the caveats that maybe we've lost the outer rings or even the sapwood, so we've got to be a bit careful with that material. We've got the disturbance information from this CID method that's actually modeling this release event. And then we can actually look at other direct things like evidence of axe marks and so forth on timbers that we're extracting out of these systems. So Before I show you some real data, I want to actually talk about an idealized woodland where there is no problems, when it doesn't exist, and it never would exist in any system. But imagine a situation where we have all pine trees will grow to 300 years old, and then they die at about 300. And when they die, then within a year they're replaced, right? And that means we have a stand that has every age class, right? From 1, 2, 3, all the way to 300 years. We've not got no real natural disturbance in this system initially. No fire, no disease, no wind flow or anything. No natural thinning. The only natural thinning is the tree dies at 300 years old, right? So, of course, it's not realistic. This is a purely idealized scenario. But if we went into that system and sampled many, many trees, then the plot of the data that would come out is that over time from 1650 to present, we have a mean age of 150 years, right? That is the mean age of the stand. The mean regeneration rate is just over 6% every 20 years. And the mean death date is 6%. And it's just a continual steady state woodland system. Now, imagine that same system, and then what we do is we remove 50% of the trees, all the trees that are over 150 years. Then the data looks a little bit different, right? So we've removed 50%, so we've got 50% of our trees are now dead, right? Now, none of the trees are 300 years old, so none of them are dying of the remaining trees. So we don't get any death for another 150 years. We get this big pulse of regeneration because all those trees we've removed, there will be then a replacement tree. And then we can see our mean stand age change like this. And then after 150 years, it's a higher value. So I want you to remember this shape, okay? Because this is kind of really important to understand the data that we can extract from these kind of data sets. So let's look at the northern cairngorms. I apologize, Western Cape, but this is the richest data set we've got as an example. So we have a lot of living material here, and then this is then supplemented by subfossil material that we've extracted from Loch Ellen, Loch Gowan, and over towards the Rivoan Pass. Okay, and you can see the replication or number of samples varies through time. Now, if we look at the mean tree age as represented by that archive, you can see it's jumping around. We have a big drop-off here in the early 16th century here, another drop-off here in the late 17th century, and so forth. You get this variability in the mean stand age in this system. There's these pulses of regeneration in these records. There are pulses of death, right, with the caveats that some of the end dates might be a bit eroded. Then we've got the disturbance history, okay, with regards to the release events. And then we've got the histogram of any information related to saw cuts. They could be axe or saw. We just put it all together. Now you could suck your eyes together, and then you could then say, okay, well, these are the periods of where we've got major timber extraction in these areas. So the 1780s, 1830s, we see that pretty much everywhere. The late 17th century, we got this weird event in the early 16th century, which Chris Smalk tells me that could not exist, but we definitely have a gap in the record here. It was very difficult to get through there, and then back in the 13th century. So we've got substantial information that's really giving compelling evidence about periods of intense timber felling, and then periods of recovery, right? This period here where we see these increases in ages, this is where the system's recovering, right? The woodland, the remaining woodland is maturing, right? And now we've got relatively old trees in the recent period. Here's Glen Affric. Again, we've got not so much replication. We're rebuilding this chronology at the moment. I wanted to highlight with the Glen Affric one, so this is the relative establishment here. We get this peak period of establishment in the early 18th century. Look at the mean tree age in Glen Affric. If you were in Glen Affric in 1710, 1720, it would not look like it does today. I guarantee it. You know, a massive event through this whole period. So, in some respects, there's nothing new I'm showing you here, but the tree ring data really gives us this rich knowledge with regards to this sort of past human disturbance on the system. So all the pine woodlands are all in a state of recovery, right? And the major last pulse may have been the sort of Napoleonic War period, but you know, in some of the areas we do see this sort of between the Second World War, First and Second World War. So that's the human story. Now I want to go to the climate story, and it's not a climate story from reconstructing climate specifically. It's actually understanding how climate is influencing growth, right? And you know, we saw a graph earlier, right? Global temperatures has risen by 1.5 degrees. But you know, who cares about what's happening globally? It's what's happening in Scotland and what's happening in the cairngorms versus the West. There are radical differences. So, firstly, this was the whole raison d'etre of what I was doing was to create a reconstruction of summer temperatures for Scotland. And because of the problems in the west, we only use data from the Cairngorms. This is the northern Cairngorms. And the green line here is the instrumental data, and then the rest of this is the reconstruction based on basically tree ring density. A nice match. And you can see how miserable it was, right? On average in the 17th century, it was 1 degree colder. We have the ills here in the 1690s. We've written a lot about this period. And back here, we have less replication, and we're working on an update in the hope of actually adding on the Glenafric data into all of this to come up with a better Scottish record. So no one in this room is interested in what the climate was doing 500 years ago. So let's move on, right? But what is important, when we were doing this work, we also, because we have a network of tree ring chronologies, we then could come up with a spatial network or reconstruction for climate, right? So these are just the grids that we put into Scotland. These are some examples. So the southwest Scotland one, red is right in the northwest, and the blue is the sort of northern Cairn. Now, I was told not to do any statistics, so let's keep this simple. Red is good. Red and darker colors means that we get a good model, high R squared, if you want to talk about this, but basically the darker the red, we get better calibration. And when we do any modeling, we want to then leave some data aside to validate it against other instrumental data. So we might calibrate on one period and then validate on the other. So this is just the mean of all the calibrated data. And then we look at the validation of the model. It's doing pretty okay in the sort of east side, certainly the Cairngorms. But as soon as we get to the west, everything started breaking down. And it was really quite demoralizing because the data's kind of good over here. I mean, the trees are cross-dating and matching quite well within themselves, but they weren't, for some reason, expressing the climate data in the same consistent way as the Cairngorms. So what do we do about this? So this is kind of ongoing work now, and we've kind of trying to go into this in a little bit more detail. So what I've done just for this talk here is now I'm focusing not on ring width now, because ring width, to model ring width is really complicated, but density is pretty good. It's driven mostly by climate. And so I'm going to present models based on, basically we're trying to predict what tree growth is and what's controlling tree growth as a function of temperature and precipitation. So we're going to build a model base from 1920 to 1950 and then try and predict what the tree growth is going to do through 1951 to present. And 2018 is important. Right? You'll see what I mean with 2018, because that's already 6 years ago. So this is just an example output here. So this is the Northern Cairngorms. Right? When I say everything is easy in the Cairngorms, everything is easy. Look out the fit. So the actual tree ring data, density data is in blue. The model fit is in red. Looks pretty good. It's explaining almost 80% of the variance. The metrics that go in, or the variables, April, May, July, August, and September temperature, positively, and then actually a little bit of inverse influence of precipitation. Right? Pine doesn't like it when it's wet, so if you get a slightly wetter summer, then it has a sort of detrimental impact on the density of the rings. But it is dominated by temperature, hence the temperature reconstruction. So if we look at the model going through, so this is using the relationships from this period and just putting in the actual instrumental data and coming up with a prediction forward. Looks pretty good. If we look at the difference between these two, just to look at the residuals, does a pretty good job, except for 1961, which happens to be the thinnest ring for 300 years in the Cairngorms, and I have no idea why. Right? So it's a bit of anomalous. It's much stronger in the ring width than it is in the data, but no model is perfect. But honestly, this is as good as it gets globally when you're doing any tree rings and climate kind of analyses. So everything behaves in the Cairngorms. So let's look at the southwest corner. So this is tree ring data. So this is the, my pronunciation is awful, so I'm going to call this north and south Glenorchy sites. And then I call this the 3C site. Okay, I'm not going to pronounce it. Again, however, same period. The modeling is pretty just as strong. You can visually see it. This time you notice, though, there's only less months. The influence of temperature is a bit weaker over in the west, but we get a stronger influence inversely, negatively, of precipitation. Now, we look at the model prediction for the future. Does a pretty good job. But if we look at the residual difference, then at the recent end, there's this crash, right? Now, it's subtle, right? At the end, the tree ring data here is actually going down, and then the predictive model should go up, and then we get these negative anomalies in the modeling. And we've noticed this for a while, and we see this all the way through the West network. This is not just these sites down in the southwest corner. So let's show the same for what I call West Central, right? Purposely for this conference. Got Kona Glen, Glen Loy, and Glen Nevis. Again, doing a reasonable job. Again, precipitation is in the model, mostly inverse. We look at the prediction into the future, and we look at the recent end. So there's something really odd happening in the last 10 years in these data. Hence, when I said this is all up to 2018 is when there's the last phase of sampling in many of these sites, we need to now go back in. So we've just, and thanks for those who give me permission, we've just done updated Glen Orchy, and we've just done Glen Fallick on the way to the conference. What else would you do on the way to a conference, right? So maybe the canary in the coal mine, who knows? This is just a decline of productivity. Doesn't mean that these are all dying, right? And I'll talk about the implications of this, right? Now, the problem we have is the instrumental data is really quite short. So we're really only assessing from sort of the early 20th century. We can maybe, for temperature, go back a bit further back in the 19th century. But if we assume that the Cairngorms being so all brilliant and heavy, then let's compare the western sites to the Cairngorms. Because in a way, if the hypothesis is that they all should be responding mainly to summer temperatures, they should be fairly consistent through time. So let's just treat the Cairngorms as the gold standard. And then if we just do, these are sort of running correlations between the Cairngorms and the southwest composite and the Cairngorms versus the western central composite here, and they're wobbling around, the correlation is 0.8. So there's a very good, strong coherence. There are wobbles, we would expect that from, just takes 1 year like 1961 to be slightly off to push that off a bit. We go to the recent period, right? Here's this crash that we just saw in the modeling, another little wobble here in the 1970s. And basically, we've done this, I've done this for all the sites against the Cairngorms, and in the recent period, we see this decoupling of a common signal of the response has changed. So this is not a fluke of just 1 or 2 sites. This is everywhere in the western sites. And it, well, you'll see in a minute where it might be worse. So what does this mean, right? So first thing, that what's controlling tree productivity and their response to climate is changing. In the Cairngorms, now I'm very loosely, I wouldn't say high elevations, but basically above 200 meters elevation, these trees, or the density in these trees, are controlled tightly, basically by July-August temperatures. That's what's driving my reconstruction. So we get a warm summer, we get a wider ring, we get a higher density, at least in the lakewood of the ring, and therefore more carbon sequestration. In the western pines, so again, same rough elevation. Remember that the tree line in the west is not as high. That in itself is a debate, right? But here we then have a weakening in the temperature limitation and an increase in the detrimental effects of precipitation, meaning that you get a wetter summer, leads to a thinner ring, leads to lower density values, and then reduced carbon sequestration. And that's consistent for most of the sites in the west, if not all. So we saw a plot of global annual temperatures before. This is Scottish annual temperatures, right? Since the end of the 19th century to the recent period, this is the 20-year period here, we've had a warming of about 1.4 degrees. I'm perfectly on time. So, but I did warn him, I do ramble sometimes. Okay, so we've got warming. Now, if this is, these are truly temperature-limited trees, warming is a great thing because the trees is like it's warmer, more productive, and the trees will track this. And the Cairngorm trees are doing that, okay? The problem is at the same time, the Scottish climate's getting wetter, right? So the end of the sort of 19th century was a little bit drier, and then the recent few decades is substantially wetter. Now, this is annual, so there are seasonal differences between winter, spring, summer, and so forth, but that's the general trend. At the same time, whoever lives here must be really miserable, right? 3 meters of rainfall per year, where we're only about half a meter, right? Sorry. So, what is more worrying is the rate of wetting is 3 times greater here than it is in the Cairngorms. Basically, there's almost no trend in the hydroclimate in the east of Scotland. In the west, 3 times greater. So it's not only wet, it's getting wetter. Not to depress anyone who's living here, okay? What are the implications here, right? Well, I think that's going to have real implications for pine productivity if this inverse relationship and the impact of precipitation on productivity, meaning it gets wetter and it's leading to a decrease in productivity. Of course, that's going to only increase. That's going to have impacts on regeneration rates. I would love to see people present maps of regeneration rates if that data exists. Because I guarantee it's going to, well, I know it's slower in the west, but how much slower? Has anyone actually quantified the rates of regeneration and these sort of stuff? And that all then comes down to then how do you manage in the future when the pressures of climate might actually be really making life even harder for you. Right? There's no policy here. There's nothing about funding and how we do this and how we all work together. This is just how the trees are responding to climate. That just maybe making life even harder for you. So, some take-home messages, right? Clearly, all these woodlands have a big human influence from past disturbance. Nothing particularly natural about any of these systems, but they're all in a state of recovery. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's going to take centuries before these get to a truly natural state. We know that when we reduce deer numbers, regeneration can be very quick. I mean, we can see that, right? I mean, pine is like a weed. Birch is like a weed. You know, if you go to Glenfeshie, you can't mountain bike up Glenfeshie anymore. There's too much birch everywhere. It's a real pain, right? So there's the good news, right, if you're into this. Now, if you're in a system where it's relatively dry over in the east, then regeneration is pretty good. But now in the west, when it's going to be wet, if you're encouraging growth, you're going to have to try and encourage growth, certainly with regards to pine, on the drier locations, right? Go to Glenfalloch, right? We were there on Sunday. Just have a walk through the Glenfalloch woodland, and it's basically one big bog with ridge systems, and those remnant trees are all on these rocky ridges. So it's going to be very hard to regenerate any pine in that situation, right? So, and again, the implications of regeneration. So I guess that's my message from all of this, right? Climate change is just going to add further pressure. Whatever great, brilliant collective plans you come together, or how much millions and billions go into the pine forest, you can't ignore the climate pressures that are going to impact this system, right? I'm talking Scotland as a whole. So on that, I think for once I'm in time, many people have helped us with all this work. It's not just me. Thank you to everyone, and thank you very much. 1 minute.
Woo! Thank you, Rob. I think there was one question there so far, which was so much information. I definitely want to watch this again. Can I do that? Yes. All these sessions are being recorded, and you will be able to watch it again at half speed if you feel like me. You need to really get your head around that. But oh my goodness, I'm looking forward to the questions, and please do fire them in. Just to go from the big picture to the ridiculously small picture, I'm delighted to announce that the 12 winning bidders for the ACF pine trees are going to get a text from Katrina very shortly, and you can collect your trees at the ACF art exhibit at the end of the day. And then I love this. I didn't even know this was happening, but the Nevis Nature Network Project Stab the Roadie competition winner, right? Is Ellie DeMambro-Denson. Congratulations, Ellie. You can collect your prize at the Nevis Network Nature Network exhibit at the end of the day, but see the things you miss if you don't browse properly. All right. Our next speaker and our final speaker of the conference is Professor Des Thompson. I'm sure many of you will know Des with over 30 years of experience working in government agencies. He's now a Leverhulme Emeritus Fellow with the Environmental Research Institute at UHI. Des has published more than 15 books. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He's a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. And in February 2024, he was elected the UN CMS COP appointed Councillor for Climate Change. So we're very privileged to have Des with us to wrap up and conclude our conference. So a big hand, please, for Professor Des Thompson.
Thanks, that's very kind. Oh, I'm breathless after that presentation, Rob. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you for having me here today for this exceptional 2 days we've had. And I have to say, special congratulations to Joyce, Helen, and the team for amazing organization. It's been absolutely brilliant. So look, presentation here on the future of Caledonian pinewoods, and it's a joint presentation. I've collaborated with a number of people, some great friends, Ron Summers, Dave Morris, who's here, Nick Kemp, Basil Dunlop, Thomas McDonnell, and Ian Wall, and we've benefited greatly from critical comments from Pat Monaghan, Glasgow University, Jeanette Hall of Nature Scott, and Daria Tutar of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And we really want to try and sum up where we've got to today in terms of the conservation and management of Caledonian pinewoods, but to try and look ahead at what we need to do for these amazing ecosystems. Just a couple of slides here and statements about the importance of these pine woods, this great link to the boreal forests of the past. They've been described as the most ancient of ancient woodlands, iconic symbol of our culture and nature. They have this extraordinary mycorrhizal association of more than, indeed, 250 species associated with them. Someone once described these areas as a living museum with a priceless genetic pool. But for me, and I suspect for many of you here, just being there, just being in a pine wood is an extraordinary experience. And of course, two great books, Chris Smout's great tome and Stephen and Carlisle's book on the native pine woods of Scotland. Extraordinary inventory, really, of the 35 surviving remnants, where they describe only pine woods directly descended from one generation to another by natural means as being Caledonian pine woods. So what are the areas we're talking about now? And Ron Summers, in his excellent book on the Abernethy Forest, and I strongly recommend you to get that book. It was published just a few years ago. Ron was able to redraw a map from McVeigh and Ratcliffe's highland plant communities to show the original distribution of the Caledonian pine woods, and superimposing on these the sort of fragments that we have today. And Ron describes these as the remaining fragments of naturally established Scots pines from the extensive Caledonian forest, including their original natural expansion. So it's a very good definition of the Caledonian pine woods. And incidentally, the book Highland Plant Communities is quite an extraordinary tome, published in 1962 by Donald McVeigh and Derek Ratcliffe. It describes fieldwork they carried out during 1956 to 1958 in the Scottish Highlands, where they were really visiting parts of the uplands that had probably never been visited before by anyone, with the exception of stalkers and shepherds. And they provide this exceptionally detailed phytosociological description of highland vegetation. It really was way ahead of its time. And we were very fortunate, 50 years after that fieldwork was undertaken, Louise Ross, a PhD student, then at Aberdeen University, carried out a repeat survey of most of the sites they surveyed. And one of her most compelling findings was that many of the plant communities that Donald and Derek described had homogenized. The boundaries of the communities were much fuzzier, and she recorded in particular a marked reduction in the bryophyte and lichen assemblage. And this has been described as homogenization of the vegetation, and it's very interesting that Andy mentioned acidic deposition, nitrogen deposition yesterday, and this was actually a very important driver in terms of forcing down the biodiversity value of the upland plant communities over the last 50 years. They were very interesting, McVeigh and Ratcliffe. You look at a picture, I took this picture in 1990 in Argyll of the pair of them, and you tend to have this impression that they must have worked very closely together and got on very well. They didn't get on particularly well. I can tell you that because when I was out with them in the field, Derek would take me to one side and he'd mutter something disparaging about Donald, and then sort of 10 paces further on, Donald would do the same. So they actually worked in separate parts of the uplands. Donald focused on the woodlands in particular, and Derek on the higher mountain vegetation. But they were exceptional observers and writers. And in fact, Donald McVeigh and Jim Lockie produced a really important book on upland land use and ecology. It was published, I think, in the mid-1970s. And much of what they're describing then still applies to the uplands now. So just a wee plug for McVeigh and Ratcliffe's book. Well, great people have worked on the Caledonian pine woods. I've just got some examples of people here. Up in the top right, the sort of memorial to Professor Stephen, Jock Carlisle shown in the middle there. Some other great characters here. I have to say a dearth of women. And I noticed the sort of comment earlier on in the questions. It is rather striking how few women have worked in Pinewoods when we go back in time, but fortunately, and looking at the audience today, that is changing greatly. So some amazing people here have made an immense contribution to our understanding the conservation and management of Caledonian pinewoods. But I want to just sort of name check one person, if I may. Thomas McDonnell, standing here in the picture. Thomas, are you here? Is Thomas here? He certainly was earlier on. Thomas deserves a round of applause for what he's done in Glenfeshie. It's absolutely exceptional. When we talk about deer management, I mean, Thomas was just so brave in terms of how he took on this sort of traditional deer management community in order to secure the sort of great success we're seeing at Glenfeshie. And Dick Balharry, of course, here deserves immense thanks for that as well. So look, great characters. And in terms of what we've been describing over the last 2 days, this sort of amazing chronology of the work that's been done on the Pinewoods from 1975, this sort of growing concern about the demise of Pinewoods to this important conference held at Coylham Bridge, through to native pinewood grants being introduced in 1978, 1991, the Native Pinewood Register, the EC Habitats Directive in 1992, and I'll say a little bit about that, through to 94, 98, the Caledonian Pinewood Inventory, with sort of key issues being described there, especially sort of referencing our concern with native pinewoods rather than just Caledonian pinewoods. And of course, in 2003, the reprint of the practice guide on the management of semi-natural woodlands. Some truly important publications that have all been touched on. And it's worth just reminding us that we do have special areas of conservation for Caledonian pinewoods with the A's. Here, the symbol in red showing the AB sites, these truly internationally outstanding examples of pine forest in Scotland. And we should never forget that internationally we have some real exemplars described as relic ingenious pine forests of Scots pine. And then through to managing the Pinewoods of Scotland, this important publication in 2004, which has some important quotes from the Stephen and Carlisle book. The structure should be semi-irregular, a mosaic of groups and stands, and it concludes we need patience. Well, my God, we need patience to work with the natural processes of the pinewood. And these aims are best achieved by focusing attention on the management of the pinewood ecosystem as a whole rather than on individual species. And then that takes us through to the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project, which we heard so much about yesterday. So findings here, 71 of the 84 pinewood inventory sites sampled, 23% of what remains critically threatened. That's a quarter critically threatened. Most lack essential characteristics of health and resilience, and we heard a very fine definition of what we mean by health and resilience yesterday. And of course, there were exceptions to that bad news, especially in the East Central Highland region, sort of improvements being recorded there. And so, that, of course, there is some good news within that report. The report made 5 recommendations, which I've shown here. I won't go through them, but the 5th one, regenerating and expanding the Caledonian pinewoods naturally, truly important and a sort of important stepping stone for us today. So this is sort of 50 years of fieldwork and endeavour. Exceptional work by exceptional individuals. But I want to try and place that in a bit of context before I say a wee bit more about where I think we should go for Caledonian pinewoods. And we need to remember, of course, we have a nature crisis and climate emergency formally declared by Scottish, UK governments. We need a nature-rich future for everyone. The Nature Scot corporate plan has the strapline of protect, restore and value. I think protect, restore and value applies equally well to Caledonian pinewoods. And on the right, the graph I've shown here really, it comes from a paper that was published in Nature in 2020 showing this sort of decline in biodiversity, and the importance of trying to bend the curve of that decline to restore biodiversity. The grey line, business as usual. The middle line, the amber line, increased conservation effort. If we have more protected areas, if we spend more on conservation and management activities, we might just be able to level off the loss of biodiversity. But it's really that green line that's so important. Increased efforts with more sustainable production and more sustainable consumption of natural resources. It's only through doing that and the other three, the increased conservation efforts, that we will get this upturn in biodiversity. And for Scotland as a whole, we know from the recently published biodiversity metric that we have seen this decline, 24% decline in abundance of recorded species since 1994, and a huge citizen science effort has gone into describe it, to producing that metric based on a whole range of bird, mammal, moth, and butterfly species. And we've seen overall a 14% contraction in species range since 1970. So it's not only Caledonian pinewoods that we're concerned with here. Biodiversity as a whole is declining and contracting. So for us, with my colleagues, we've been thinking through about the sort of new framework that we need for Caledonian pinewoods, and really urging us all to operate at scale and in a connected fashion, having major reductions in deer populations, having greater legal protection for expansion areas, and ensuring as best we can to climate-proof the environment. So just some examples with some slides here from Ron Summers, who's in the audience. Expansion of the Caledonian pinewoods. We want to see the current expansion zones extended to within whole river catchments and to as high as possible in terms of natural altitudinal limits, where topography, climate, and land use will permit, and remove the distinction between regeneration and buffer zones. And you can see here with these planted non-conifers, Sitka spruce to the left here, how they are preventing the natural expansion of the Caledonian pinewoods. No planting and removal of non-native species. Ideally, no planting of either non-native or native trees and shrubs. The removal of non-native trees planted and self-seeded and shrubs from core areas and the proposed expansion areas, and the removal of planted trees and shrubs in core areas and expansion zones. And here, again, an example, pine forest with Douglas firs self-seeding in the foreground, undermining the integrity of the wood. Deer management. We've heard a lot about deer management, and that's echoed throughout the discussions over the last 50 years of Caledonian pinewoods. Deer populations should be maintained at well below 4 per km squared for Scots pine recruitment, and less than 2 per km squared for recruitment of more palatable broadleaf trees and shrubs. We heard a fantastic presentation from James yesterday on this. And existing deer and stock fences should be removed once stated deer densities have been achieved. And in terms of wider measures, new hill roads, the Caledonian pine zone should not be constructed. Restoration orders, we need to think about restoration orders being established through policy or legislative changes, and I'll touch on this shortly, and applied to all 84 core Caledonian pinewood areas. And all core and expansion zones should be legally protected. They're not at the moment. And if we see none of this action taking place, we're going to see continued self-seeding. We're going to see a diminished integrity of core and expansion areas through current planting and through the impacts of past planting. And of course, we're going to see limits to expansion of the pinewoods, as you can see here, the sort of buffer, the prevention of natural expansion of pinewood. And then we come to climate change, the final driver, which Rob has so elegantly described, and the sort of of course, the great evidence base we have now in temperature and precipitation changes, not just over the years, but regionally. But we also need to be mindful of the tipping points, the cascades that are ahead of us. There really are alarming changes taking place, whether it's fires and pest outbreaks in the boreal forest, coral reefs, of course, dying off at large scale in recent years, the loss of ice in the West Antarctic. Extraordinary examples of tipping points. And for the climate, I mean, a very real concern in terms of what will we actually see happen to the climate, not just in Scotland, but in the Northern Hemisphere. And this long-term cooling that's on the horizon, what's called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the AMOC, where we're seeing the current Gulf Stream, which normally flows up to the north, providing sort of warmth, but with the diminishing ice sheet, greater precipitation, and the sort of greater flow from rivers, freshwater going into the seas. We're actually seeing this turning around. And the upshot is, in possibly 100 years, we're going to see this mass cooling. And this blue area shown here shows that temperature may decline by up to 2.5 degrees centigrade. And as a letter to the Nordic Council for Ministers stated recently, it's quite possible in the 100 years that in the area shown in blue, there will be no agricultural productivity. So further afield, unless we can control climate change and do all we can to manage climate change, actually, in the long term, in the far north, we're going to see this catastrophic cooling. And for pine forests, in that case, that represents an additional challenge. So just thinking about the sort of nature crisis and the climate crisis, I think it's just worth reflecting that, of course, in the government as a whole, internationally and nationally, we have very important commitments. Back in December 2022, in Kunming and then Montreal, the Global Biodiversity Framework was signed off internationally by the United Nations. And indeed, the Scottish government at the time made a great fuss of this and published its own statement on the importance of biodiversity. Within that Global Biodiversity Framework, there are very important statements that apply to Caledonian pinewoods. Protecting 30% of our land and sea by 2030, well, we've got a long way to go on land. Eliminating, minimizing impacts of invasive species, sustainable management of forestry, eliminating subsidies harmful to biodiversity. A whole range of statements in that framework that apply to Caledonian pinewoods. And in December 2022, quite literally during the Biodiversity COP15, Scottish Government published its draft 25-year biodiversity strategy. In autumn of last year, it published its delivery plan for consultation, a very ambitious delivery plan. And any day now, a strategy and delivery plan will be published by the Scottish Government with strong reference to the Natural Environment Bill, setting statutory targets to prevent the decline, the further decline of biodiversity in Scotland. And within that delivery plan, and I hope a lot of the ambition persists within the final delivery plan, there are 5 priority themes. And within the sort of actions that are described there, again, there are very important actions that apply to Caledonian pinewoods. Setting statutory targets for ecosystem restoration, well, that's what we're talking about with pinewoods. Getting up to 30 by 30, 30% of the land being well protected by 2030. Nature-rich farming, agricultural reform, woodland biodiversity being strongly supported by government. Species introduction recovery program as part of the recovery of important species. And of course the Nature Restoration Fund, which has already done so much to support nature restoration projects. So my point is, the government has made very important commitments, undertakings to what we've been describing over the last 2 days. And right now, literally right now, there is the Biodiversity COP 16 It's happening in Colombia. John Swinney presented to that 2 days ago, outlining what Scotland intended to do to ensure that our country is nature positive. We have a delegation here at the COP from the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. And so there is an important UK and Scottish input to that COP. And again, looking at the United Nations priorities at the COP, tackling biodiversity loss, implementing, that means putting into practice the global biodiversity framework, mainstreaming nature, and even within the EU, key priorities, integrating tackling biodiversity loss and climate change, mobilizing resources for the implementation of the framework, having a network of centres for technical and scientific cooperation, and adopting a strong programme of work concerning Indigenous and local communities. So it's all there. There is a vitally important commitment from government. So now, my plea is that it really is time for action now. We need to work at the larger scale to restore these pine woods, ideally connecting land holdings of public bodies, ENGOs, and willing landowners, and we're seeing much evidence of that at the moment, sustaining natural regeneration long term and supporting it across expansion areas, reducing these deer populations. I was at a workshop this morning, and I think I commented we could have been in that workshop 30 years ago having the same conversation. We have to do so much more to reduce deer populations and work very closely with the deer management community, and progress is being made. Embrace the Caledonian Pinewoods Partnership that we've heard about, mobilise public and political support. And I can tell you now that the partnership will fail unless we mobilise political support. We need political support for this, or it will not happen. We need to be ambitious. And most of all, remember, we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Let's make this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Des, for that fantastic rallying cry. Rob, where are you? Do you want to come up and join us up here? So we're into our final Q&A. Some good questions coming through. And they should pop up on the screen in a bit. But I'm just going to kick us off. And I think probably this first one is for you, Rob. Do you have the data to investigate whether the precipitation effects on pine growth, whether it affects pine growth differently at different ages? Are saplings and young trees more or less affected than mature trees? Do we have any data that helps us with that?
The short answer is no. We purposely haven't sampled any of the young trees. When we were on Sunday, when we were in Glenfalloch, there is areas of regeneration, so you could go in there, and there's probably 20-year-old trees in there. So that would be a whole different project to go in and actually go in and sample those kind of studies. It would be needed. It would be very interesting, because you probably got a whole new generation that's germinated to maybe a wetter climate, right? It's, and the next generation may be better adapted to modern climate conditions than older trees that germinated in the Little Ice Age when it was cold and dry. So no, we don't have the data. Great. If someone wants to fund it,
So technically, that is absolutely possible.
Yep.
There were some researchers here, so yeah, clock that. Speak to Rob if you're interested in following that one up. Yes, another related question for you, Rob. Are these trends, do we know if they're mirrored in other tree species?
We've just started an oak study, early days. Freddie's in the audience now. Ask us in 3 years' time. But no, we haven't looked at any other species. So there is a similar phenomenon in other countries, but it's more related to warming and a loss of temperature limitation. You can go to southern Europe, and then they worry about drought, right? We kind of have an opposite situation here. So I've only focused on the pine.
I'm just going to ask you for a gut reaction to this question. You kind of hinted at the mechanism of evolution as something that, in theory, could allow the genetic base and the pinewoods to respond. These changes are happening quickly. How hopeful are you that we might see some of that genetic change happening to respond to these changes, or are the climate changes just going to be too quick? And Des, you might have a view on that as well. I don't know.
I was once in northern Germany. There was a group, and they were planting seeds, Scots pine seeds from all over Europe and planting in northern Germany to see how and basically the seeds that germinate are the ones that are best adapted to that environment. It doesn't matter if the seed stock came from Spain or came from Scandinavia. So I think you're probably, with the kind of relatively plastic genetics that the seed stock of pine has, right? You know, it has, I think, isn't it the largest distribution of conifer trees, certainly in the Northern Hemisphere? So yeah, I'm trying to be positive. Why not, right? But you know, you would have to have groups to test that to see actually how they would adapt. So you've got to remember, we have only sampled those old trees that were germinating in a very different climate than we have now. That's probably part of why some of them are struggling.
And
so I don't have
sorry, just riffing again on that, and a question for either of you is we haven't really talked about the opportunity for evolution coming through natural regeneration as opposed to planting, but is that a significant enough rationale for us also to be really thinking carefully about regen as a primary mechanism rather than planting? Does that offer more of a route towards evolution in response to climate change?
Natural regeneration is just so much more attractive. And in terms of supporting biodiversity, in terms of the structural and temporal diversity that you're getting, why would you not want to see that natural regeneration take place? When you think of the areas we go to where we've got these naturally regenerating woods, there's something truly special. So, yeah, I think it's very hard to argue against that.
And I guess one of the things I've been pondering and maybe discussing with some of my colleagues as we think about the deer discussion and the deer debate, I'm not hearing many people talk about the impact of deer on effectively breaking the evolutionary mechanism for responding to these sorts of rapid changes. But the way I understand it, that if the regen is getting chomped, we're effectively stopping a route out of this through evolution, and therefore, as we think about the rationale for controlling deer and for natural regen, I think increasingly we also need to be recognizing that it offers opportunity through genetic modification that I'm not hearing many people talk about at the moment. All right, this is a question that was on my mind and I didn't have the guts to ask it, so thank you people for asking this question. And the question is Scots pine essentially a continental species, or as it is primarily a continental species, and Robbie said it's distributed widely, but are we not effectively right on the western wet margins of its natural range? And if that's changing, are we fighting a losing battle? And should we think perhaps differently about whether actually we're going to be able to continue in the west? And I'm going to kind of riff on that again. I was looking at that map of where we think Scots pine originally was. Should we be thinking intentionally about creating the pine woods of the future further east and perhaps further south? So is it a lost battle? Should we keep going? Should we keep fighting?
I don't
the
know
fact that we're on the edge?
You feel about this, Rob, but I mean, it's actually very special being on the edge of the distribution, and what you've just said applies to many ecosystems, never mind plants and animals. And actually, we're very fortunate in Scotland because we have these very steep oceanic gradients of coolness, wetness, windiness, giving us actually this amazing diversity of habitats from east to west, with the added variability that you've been describing, Rob, in terms of elevated precipitation in the west compared with the east. So let's not knock that. Let's sort of play to that strength, the diversity we've got from east to west, and therefore the challenge of doing that bit more in the west to restore our pine woods is so important. And I thought what James described yesterday ecologically in terms of what's happening, in terms of deer impacts, is absolutely spot on. I think it was James in terms of the extent of millennia we have in the west, and therefore for winter grazing and browsing by deer, there's much less heather. And so, of course, it's the pine. So that means we've got to up our efforts to reduce deer densities and actually to try and reduce the amount of millennia and increase the extent of heather. But no, let's celebrate being an edge of range country instead of, wringing our hands and saying, I'm being despairing.
I mean, just as a quick response, just because we're seeing a wobble doesn't necessarily mean that these aren't going to regenerate. It might be, Shayla was very clear, you needed patience. And in the beginning it was slow and it got quicker and quicker, and just maybe in the west it's going to be that bit slower. And the ideal of connecting everything might be that bit harder, because you might be having to sort of find drier corridors if precipitation. You've got to remember, it's kind of preliminary work. You need to do that systematically over the whole network, but why wouldn't it be possible here? Okay, if the trees are growing slower in the west, but they're still a functional forest system, then absolutely, it just means you have a different forest system from the drier east to the wetter west, with the flora assemblages being different, of course. So no, I wouldn't give up at all. That wasn't my message, and if you got that message, I apologise. That wasn't the aim at all.
Right, thank you. Des, a question for you. You suggested that we should be removing planted trees from CPI sites. Do you want to unpack that a little bit for us?
Well, you know, it's 80...
Including native trees, so not just... Yeah. So
these are 80 special areas. Some of the pictures showed just the impact these planted trees are having on the expansion of the sort of natural Caledonian pinewood. So what's wrong with having that as the ambition? I know it's idealistic, it's going to be very difficult to achieve, but why not make these as good as they can be?
Simple answer. Yeah, good. Some support from that in the audience. Anyone in the room from Nature, Scott, who wants to pop up? I can ask the question, but I'm not sure that either of our candidates can. Well, maybe Des can. It'd be interesting to get a perspective on this. Are Nature, Scott, playing a significant enough role in pinewood conservation? And
yes.
Engaging in challenging resistant landowners enough. So give that to Des, but if anyone else from Nature, Scott, wants to pop up and take the mic later, you can.
Yes, I think all the public bodies are doing the best at the moment. The problem is they're being starved of resources. And, you know, for Nature, Scott, you know, they've got immense pressures at the moment. Hopefully we will have this very ambitious biodiversity strategy and a delivery plan. And a lot of the delivery will lie with Nature Scott, Forestry Land Scotland, Scottish Forestry, the ENGOs, National Trust for Scotland and others. There's only so much that Nature Scott can do, but knowing, having worked for Nature Scott, I know that they're doing their level best. It's fantastic. We've got staff here from Nature Scott as well as from the other bodies.
Right.
Well, thank you. I think two of them applauded there.
If anyone from Nature Scott wants to pop up and just add another element to that, or I'm aware that often there's great work going on that some of these agencies are doing that we don't all necessarily know about. So if anyone wants to pop up and tell us something exciting and encouraging that's going on, then feel free to do that either now or just come up and linger here. We've got another 15 minutes.
I mean, just Cairngorms Connect, fantastic example of great partnership between RSPB, Nature Scott, Forestry Land Scotland, variety of partners. And, you know, Nature Scott, managing the Nature Restoration Fund, that has been immensely challenging. A wonderful £65 million fund that we've had, which of course is under siege at the moment. And having seen behind the scenes the effort that goes into assessing the grant applications and trying to approve them, a lot of that work is unseen, but actually it's highly important.
All right, thank you. Another question that I'm sure is on all of our minds: how do we stop plantations of non-native tree species being established close to our pine woods to limit issues of self-seeding of non-native trees into those woods? We've heard plenty of examples of how we're trying to address the problems that were kick-started 50 years ago, yet there's a sense that we're still creating future headaches for those who are coming behind us. How do we respond to that and deal with that? And again, we've got folks from Scottish Forestry here who may want to, you're very welcome to come and give a response to that.
We'll learn lessons from the past. You know, be much more careful in terms of approving forestry schemes and making sure we avoid these problems that we've had in the past.
Anyone else in the room want to give a perspective on that? We've got a handheld mic here. If the questioner wants to unpack that, it's a key question. We've been chewing on that in the Woodland Trust internally. I wonder if can you imagine being back here in 100 years' time? What are the key questions people are going to be asking? And as they look back to the proceedings from our conference, how confident are we that we were talking about the issues that they're going to be wrestling with in 100 years' time? And my instinct is that's going to be a massive one. All right, a bit of kickback here, Des. Is your idea of preventing all non-native planting actually realistic? Doesn't seem very pragmatic given our current reliance on timber imports. So I guess we talked about removing native planted trees from within these areas. but we've got a huge growing dependency on timber. We're, I think, the second biggest importer behind China. We recognize the need for a sustainable timber industry. How do we balance that with all that we're excited about? How do we get this right?
No, that's a fair point, of course, but we're talking about a tiny number of sites. You know, that's my point. You know, it's less than 100 sites that we're talking about here. What's wrong with being idealistic about trying to avoid all of the problems that we've been discussing over the last 50 years? So that, you know, that's why we're saying we're at a tipping point now for that tiny number of sites. So why shouldn't we do everything we can to make sure that they persist into the future?
Okay, right. Rob, one for you. Yeah, I mean, we're back to Western Pinewoods and your Western Pinewoods problem. Would you care to speculate on the scope for our Western Pinewoods to recover their previous landscape cover in the changing climate?
Well, the first thing I mentioned that, you know, what I showed, the data went up to 2018, right? We've updated a few sites. Maybe the update, it will bobble, you know, bounces back, right? It could be like that 61 and that period in the Cairngorms is just for some reason the trees have decoupled for a few years. But if this decline continues, then going back to the original question about, well, what's the younger age class in those areas where regeneration is happening? Perhaps they are the future, and then maybe we just have to hope that the old stock survives long enough to provide seed stock for the next generation. And then that further emphasizes why regeneration is so important, right? And, you know, it's not just a matter of deer reduction. We had that in the workshops. You know, how do you actually then set up these systems to encourage as much regeneration as possible to the point that then it doesn't matter about the deer so much in the future, that you've got a sort of big enough population. Now, this is out of my remit, but this is your job, right? It's what the data currently suggests that we just should be a little bit worried, you know, but, you know, another 10 years of data, it could continue. And if it did continue, then I would be quite worried. It's literally only 10 years worth of trend. You know, we're not talking about the whole woodland system's going to die off, right? Let's just, you know, it just means it's decoupled a bit. And you can see periods in the past, for whatever reason, it decouples. It's just, what is the driver here? My hypothesis is precipitation, but there could be other variables, right? That's, you know, so, you know, the experimental design needs to be changed for the future, for sure, to really test these issues.
Shout out for the importance of data science and research. Des, I'm maybe going to fire this one at you. There's a sense that we are having very similar discussions to those that were had. I don't know if you were at the 1994 Pinewood conference, but we're talking about the same issues. Would you like to sort of reflect on how we failed over those last decades and how we can do things differently going forward? What are the key lessons we learn as we look back?
Yeah, well, I hate reflecting on failure, so forgive me if I don't do that at the end of the conference. But what has changed is we now have governments internationally and nationally saying we have a climate emergency and a nature crisis. We've got the advent of a natural environment bill, hopefully a very ambitious delivery plan for a very ambitious Scottish biodiversity strategy. So the framework, and importantly, the political commitment is there. And what we now have to do, which we couldn't do before, because we didn't have this framework in place before with government, is really to hold the feet of government to the fire and say, you've made these commitments. Now you've got to realize these commitments and ensure that we actually bend the biodiversity curve, and especially for these supremely important ecosystems, we do all we can to restore them. So what's changed is the government commitment, and that's why I said at the end, this partnership will fail unless we have a strong political commitment to implementing it.
I think I'm also reflecting, my understanding is that the draft Pinewood management principles are really another way of answering that question, which is to say that this is the succinct learning of the last 30 years, that unless we base what we do going forward on these management principles, we're kind of condemning ourselves to repeat that cycle. So I'm just another shout out. If you believe strongly that we need a different way forward, then please put your comments on those draft Pinewood management principles. I think the more people that can scribble beside them to say we think this is the correct track, I think the more useful that's going to be. And if you think we're missing anything there, please do annotate that so that we pick that up. James, do you want to pop up and ask this question yourself and explain a little bit about your thinking behind it? Is James in the audience and willing to do that? Come on up, James. Hand to James McGirt from NTS. I'm just going to give a great plug to James and his team at Glencoe for doing some awesome things there. Next time you drive through Glencoe, stop and take a walk through and see what's happening on the ground. Some brilliant work that James is involved in. But yeah, James, why don't you ask the question and tell us a little bit about what's behind the question? Oh, and we'll get you mic'd. Good to go.
I just saw there were a few comments on here about non-native species seeding into woodlands, and so if we need forestry to make sure we aren't importing timber and we need to grow it at home, just wanted to know, is it realistic to be doing more with native trees, kind of bordering onto these areas that are getting spruce seeding into them, or if there's a very good reason why spruce needs to be the tree that's grown there to have productive forestry?
Thank you. All right. Well, who from FLS wants to take that response? Come on. There's a few of you here, we know. Brilliant. Well done. We've got Graham. Thank you, Graham. Come on up.
Thought might as well step forward. I could see where that was going, so happy to do that. So yeah, it's a wider question there. I will go back again to what Des has said, that the 80 special sites, they're very precious. So I totally agree with what Des has said about our remnant Caledonian pinewoods. That's what to keep restating that, I think, really. But in terms of the wider question that's on the screen there from James, well, the good news is that absolutely Sitka spruce is the preferred commercial timber tree, being a white wood for many of the timber customers in the UK, as it's across much of Europe. But the good news is that there already is strong demand for Scots pine, particularly in the east side of Scotland. So you have, if you look at the northeast of Scotland, Scots pine is often the best tree to grow because it's much drier climate, and several of our customers, they are set up to take Scots pine. So that's already there. So I think that's often not understood. And then in recent discussions that we've been having with Scottish forestry colleagues and the main timber customers, a recognition with climate change, we have to diversify. There'll still be, I think, across Scotland, a big core of Sitka spruce, and particularly in the west, it does grow very well. But as time goes by, there's a greater look at a bigger diversity of species. And if you look back in time at history, it's a chicken and egg thing. There wasn't Sitka spruce in the past. It's from North America. Because sufficient was grown, of course, you get a market develops on the back of that. So if you look into the future now, more diversity of species is definitely part of the future in terms of climate change resilience, and having sufficient of other species to have a market is part of that story as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, James, for you. Other one maybe mentioned is birch. If you look at fuel wood demand, it's very high. Birch is a species that I live in Inverness. You see birch is imported from Latvia into Inverness, and it goes into the West Fraser factory to make orientated strand boards. So there is a whole range of options, which is really good. And it tends to be that markets follow what's growing. That's been the history in this country. So hopefully that's a little insight into what's happening in terms of the timber market.
Thanks, Graham, and you can continue that conversation afterwards. Oh, sorry. Come on. Hey, Graham.
Sitka spruce will produce more volume than Scots pine by about 50% on sites where Sitka will grow. Sitka has branches like Scots, but the branches produce knots which don't fall out. Unless you prune Scots pine, you get dead knots and you get holes in the trees. So you get a better quality product and more of it if you grow Sitka spruce. And we want volume.
All right, now you know, James. We are very close to time, but I am going to ask this last one question because it was it's really something that was well illustrated right at the start, wasn't it, when we asked who was in the room? And we had originally set out as an organising committee to do all we could to invite owners and to encourage CPI owners to come here, and we haven't got many in the room. So it's a kind of key question for us going forward. But any reflections from you gents on what we can do to engage more effectively with Pinewood owners? How do we do that? We've tried, and we've still got a way to go. What could we be doing better?
Well, I mean, have I lost? Oh, I'm very thankful to all site owners. I've never had an issue where I haven't had permission to go in. And as far as I'm concerned, it's my job to, often the first thing they want to know is, how old are my woods, right? That's the first question. And then maybe the next one is how healthy are these woodlands, right? That's the question we're talking about. Are these now growing in a sustainable way? Are they in some sort of decline? I think these are so it's my job as, I guess, the scientist to communicate back to these landowners to say, yeah, everything's fine, or maybe there's a bit of a wobble, right? And then they might want to interact with other groups with regards to how to manage that situation if there is something that's so, for me, it's been a very important relationship to keep them on side and to report back. And most of the time, it's not arduous. I'm not writing huge reports, it's usually a one-page email with a couple of figures, and everyone's happy, and I think it's very good for anyone working the Pinewoods to keep that rapport going. So I think that's...
No, I agree, and I think the conversation is so important. I mean, the conversations we've been having over the last 2 days that we're increasingly having with landowners, land managers, that's really healthy. It's government I come back to. Now that government's sort of signed up to us having a nature emergency, climate crisis, we've got to put the resources into tackling both. That's what's so important. Land managers get it. They want to make sure that it's appropriate guidance and support to let them do what they can to boost biodiversity. So the conversation is so important, and it needs to be a two-way conversation, but we need to mobilize government to provide necessary support.
Thank you. And I'm conscious that we do have a lot of Pinewood managers here, and I'm guessing most of those Pinewood managers are in conversation with the owners. So I guess there's a special responsibility on those of us in that category to be making sure that key messages from today are being fed through to those we're working with. Loads more questions. Thank you for sharing them. Those that have got lots and lots of votes behind them, we'll try and find ways to answer and post online. So thank you for doing that. But in the meantime, would you please thank our two professors, Rob Wilson and Des Thompson. Thank you. All right, we are nearly done, but there's a few things just to finish off. So much new information to ponder, so many rich conversations had. When the conference organisers sat down to plan this event, they were pretty clear that the desired outcome was change and action. It's actually pretty easy to, it's hard, but it's relatively easy to organise a conference that people have a great time at. If you get together with like-minded people and you tell some great stories and you create the right opportunities, people will have a good time. But the organising group was pretty clear that if people came here, had a nice time, filled in an evaluation form, gave us 10 out of 10 and went home and didn't do much, then we would fundamentally have failed in our ambition. We're excited, I think, that there's a sense of moving forward together through the Pinewood Partnership as a vehicle that can take some of these key things forward. But I think we also want to just recognize that each of us as individuals have agency here. We all have things that we can do and that we could do for our Pinewood. So before we leave and before we get caught up in the busyness of our inboxes and all the things that have been piling up while we've been here having a good time, we wanted in these final moments of the conference to create a little bit of calm space to allow us to reflect on what we'd heard and to identify something, each of us as individuals, that we will do in the light of all that we've heard and experienced in the last couple of days. It's very easy to say they should do this and they should do that and owners need to do that and Nature Scott need to do that. But what about us? So if we're cued for music, I'm going to set the timer on my phone for 3 minutes and we're going to listen to some of that nice music that we heard last night and we're going to ask for quiet. And we're just going to ask you to take some time and jot down in your notebook something that you think you could do as you leave this conference. What's your own personal response? So scribble it in your notebook. And then we'll just do this slightly differently, Jill. At the end of 3 minutes, if you feel comfortable to do that, we're going to ask you to share that on Slido. But we're not going to beam it on the screen for now, okay? But if you feel comfortable in sharing your commitment, and we can post that on the website later, then please do. It will by default be anonymous, so that's great. But if actually you've got something you'd like to do and you'd really like to hook up with other people in the conference who are interested in carrying on that conversation or maybe supporting with that, and you want to put your name to it, then feel free to do that. That's another way that you can kind of raise a flag and say, I'm leaving this conference interested to do this, and I'm really keen to hear from anyone else who'd like to join me in that endeavor. So 3 minutes of quiet and calm, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you. If you feel confident and comfortable to share that, then please do on Slido. We'll not stick it on the screen, but if you want to nail your colors to the mast and then connect with like-minded people, please do that. And if you didn't, on your little action point, say, I'm going to affirm that I think the Pinewood management principles are on the right track, or if you didn't say, I'm going to sign the conference resolution, or if you didn't say, I'm going to back Andy Whiteman's motion for some more teeth and ambition in this, then please think about doing that. We will have people with a board at the door so that you can't walk past that and forget to do either of those things. So please do consider doing that before you leave. All right, a few thank yous as we close our conference. Firstly, a huge thank you to you for coming. It wouldn't have been much of a conference without you, and thank you for engaging so positively in all that we've been doing. It's just been a real sense of energy and excitement, and people willing to share openly and honestly. Thank you for that. That's been tremendous. Thank you to our tech team for a pretty flawless service to us. We're grateful for you making our jobs so much easier. Thank you to all our fantastic presenters. I've just heard so many people say, the quality of those presentations was truly awesome. People have put such care and thought into them, and I just want to say particularly thank you for keeping to time. I know that I can tell that people have been presenting and preparing and practicing this so well in advance. So thank you for the care that you have put into making all that happen. Thank you to workshop leads. Thank you to those who hosted our field trips. And of course, thank you again to those organizations who've supported us financially. And I want to also pay particular tribute to a couple of former colleagues, Alistair Firth and Alan Crawford, who I guess have been the people who really prodded us at the Woodland Trust to say, come on, we need to be pulling people together. And I think I knew, but I had forgotten. Alan reminded me this morning that actually these conversations began as we approached the 25th anniversary of the last Pinewood conference, and they were slightly derailed by COVID. So actually the gestation for this conference has been probably 6 or 7 years in the running. So a big thank you to Alan and to Alistair for that provocation. But there have been some people who have played a really particularly significant role in making all this happen. And I'm going to ask Richard Thompson to come up and just say a particular word of thanks to some real stars. And Richard's going to use this radio mic, so on you come, Richard.
Thank you very much, Alistair. I'm going to forget if I don't do this now. So the first thing I'd like to do is to thank Alistair for being such an excellent chair. I think you've been amazing. So a round of applause for Alistair, please.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, yeah, I would like to give my thanks to 3 very special ladies who have been absolutely pivotal in the organisation of this conference. They're 3 ladies who are very, very passionate about Pinewoods. They're very knowledgeable about Pinewoods. And they are particularly sort of instrumental in the way that we will go forward, I think, with the direction with this partnership. And the first person I would like to thank is Jill. So Jill, do you want to come up?
Come on.
Jill.
Woo!
Now Jill calls herself a communicator. She's extremely passionate about native woods. I think she's from Fort William originally, and I first met Jill in Poochkin Pinewood with the ancient tree hunt. Thank you. Do you want to actually do the presentation of that? Otherwise, I'm going to drop it. Now, come here. So, round of applause for Jill. Now, Julie Stoneman couldn't be here, but Jill and Julie are solely responsible, between the two of them, they are responsible for branding the word rainforest. And that, as that might sound a little thing, but that has been massively powerful, and it's got the word rainforest in, I think, however many manifestos at the last Scottish elections, and it's had a huge impact. And I was an old curmudgeon, and I said, oh, I'm going to carry on calling them Atlantic woodlands, for goodness sake. But they said, no, you're not allowed to. You've got to call them rainforest. And they were absolutely right, and it's had a huge, powerful effect. And I've every confidence that you will help us to make the Pinewood brand very powerful. So thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Jill.
Next person, I don't know where she's hiding. I'd like Helen to come out of the woodwork wherever you're hiding. Where are you, Helen?
Woo! Come on.
Come on up. All these goodies are wonderful, aren't they? Now, having attended Oliver's workshop, I can tell you that this species occurs in pine woods and rainforests. So Helen, please come up. So Helen's been working away so hard I would say largely in the background, quietly working away. And it's thanks to you that we have this incredible quality of graphics and the professional look of this conference, as well as a huge amount of other organisation that you've been doing. So thank you so much, Helen. You've really helped to make this a very, very professional conference. The look of it, but also the running of it and the organisation of it. So thank you very much indeed. And lastly, the most diminutive in stature of the, what were those fungi called that you said? The russet caps. The russet caps, yes. So I wonder where is she hiding? Where's Joyce? Here comes Joyce. Ooh. Joyce is... Joyce is the most remarkable russet cap you'll ever come across. And I will greatly miss all the emails that I've had. I genuinely will. Just Joyce, again, has been working away. Woo!
Salted caramel pine cones. Who would have thought it? Wow. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Joyce is extremely committed to pinewood restoration and is extremely knowledgeable about pinewoods as well, and has not just been organising this conference, but has been just quietly prodding it in the right direction. And you've made a huge difference to the structure and the ambition of this conference, Joyce. So thank you. And most of all, for me, was the musical event last night, the poetry, which would definitely not have happened. That was your brainchild. And that was very special for me as well. So thank you so much, Joyce.
Well, I would just like to thank all the other people that I've been working with over the last 6 months, because it has been 6 months in the making. And there's been a management team, sometimes quite difficult to get hold of because they've been out on field work in very remote locations, down gullies with no mobile signal. But yes, it couldn't happen unless you were working with a great team of people. So I'd just like to thank all of those of you in the room today that have helped to make that possible. Yeah, and it's been a very, very exciting thing to be part of, and it's just been a delight to see you all engaging in everything so positively, and yeah, it's wonderful. And I'm looking forward to seeing the Pinewood Partnership going forward, and I hope you all sign up to it in one way or another before you leave, because otherwise you won't get your goodie bag with some very interesting things in it. Even more interesting than the salted caramel pine cones. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. Yes, and there's been a fantastic conference organising team behind these guys. I'm going to pay tribute to Doug and Alexa as well over here in the corner, who've just done so many amazing things. So thank you, guys. As Joyce mentioned, please keep your eye on the website. That is where so much of the content from today, or these last few days, the presentations, the feedback, the summaries, and some of the perhaps other answers to those questions will be posted. We hope that will evolve into a website for the new partnership. So that is definitely a place to keep track of. Please, please, please give us your feedback. A lot of time invested in trying to get this right. It's really, really helpful if we can get your honest feedback on what we've done well and what we could do better. The forms are in your pack. Please try and do that before you leave if you can. I know it's very easy to forget once you've gone. There's tea and coffee available in the foyer now for those particularly with long journeys ahead. Don't rush. If there's someone you really need to talk to, opportunities for that informal conferencing going on. But other than that, we are done. Farewell. Thank you. Safe home. Cheery and Drasta. Bye for now.